I was compared a lot to Hitler, sometimes to Stalin, occasionally to Mao Zedong. But I don't know. It was like, did these people read the book?
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Surprising Ethics, the podcast that always offers a surprising idea about ethics and political theory in every single episode. Today, we talk about personal liberty and the state, and we've got a really lively interview for you. So thank you so much for tuning in. So across most of the globe, liberty is highly prized. We are, though, familiar with having to give up our liberty to protect others. We know that we can't drive at 200 miles an hour down some residential street because it might result in other people being harmed or killed. But another question, and a much more controversial one, is about whether we ought to give up some of our personal liberties to protect ourselves. And that's our question today. And the question arises because obviously humans aren't perfect, and we do tend to undermine ourselves at one stage or another. Perhaps the latest type of mistake to be added to the collective list of human mistakes is social media and spending hours and hours on it only to feel worse by the end. But that's normally a kind of trivial example. We self-sabotage in much more major ways. We make much bigger mistakes. And in some cases, we almost literally dig our own graves. So in light of our tendency to make big mistakes, should governments remove many of our liberties to stop us harming ourselves, just as they remove many of our liberties to protect others? Some people say yes, and they defend paternalism. So we can define paternalism as where someone intervenes to get someone else to do something they ordinarily wouldn't do with the benevolent intention to help that person. So here's an example. Suppose you're at a party and Smith reaches for a glass of petrol or gasoline, thinking it's gin, and raises it to his lips to drink. And you rush over and slap it out of his hands. Your action is paternalistic, because paternalism is by definition benevolent in intent. You do this to help him, to save his life. But if someone else comes along and slaps the glass out of his hands or grabs it from him because they want the petrol for their car and they just regard Smith as a rival user of that gasoline or petrol, that's not paternalistic. They're just looking for personal gain. So government policy is paternalistic when it aims to protect people from themselves with benevolent intent. For example, by making seatbelt laws a mandatory requirement. So, as always, let's look at the status quo. Despite the fact that paternalism is benevolent, the status quo, I think, stands strongly against it. It's anti-paternalism and pro-individual liberty. It says, look, we should be at liberty to forge our own lives and to make our own personal decisions without someone else intervening to stop us from doing what we ourselves want to do. So the great 19th century English liberal philosopher John Stuart Mill said this: the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. In other words, the state really mustn't intervene in Jack's decisions to help Jack. They can only intervene in his decisions to help someone else. So Mill's view has some echoes in the kind of cries of nanny state that sometimes ring out when governments try to introduce taxes on sugary drinks or some such. So here's a clip featuring a modern day complaint about the nanny state.
You're the one who persuaded me of the slippery slope theory, which is, well, I'll come for this, I'll come for that, I'll come for the next thing. And actually, an awful lot of the people involved in these campaigns are actually prohibitionists. They're anti-fun, is what they are. And I realised, well, I wanted laws against the smoking. I made life so much more pleasant for me and the majority of people who aren't smokers. But then they came for pretty much everything else after that.
This is Julia Hartley-Brewer, a British journalist and presenter, claiming that the UK ban on smoking indoors around 2006 in public spaces has led to a nanny state.
They're coming for chocolate bars and fizzy drinks and everything. My worry was they're going to come for my wine and my fizz at some point. That's next on the list. And that has convinced me that, yeah, maybe we don't want a nanny state after all.
Okay, so one of the best people to ask about this issue of individual liberty versus paternalism and our own good is the philosopher Sarah Conl. Sarah Conl is a professor emerita of philosophy at Bowdoin College in the US, and she's written 3 books about liberty and its limits. And one of these books is a book directly on the issue of paternalism called Against Autonomy, Justifying Coercive Paternalism. And I'm really grateful that Sarah is with me to discuss this book today. In this conversation, we cover arguments for paternalism, seatbelt laws, romance, smoking, fizzy drinks, hierarchy, respect, cognitive bias, how far paternalistic legislation should go, control, when to trust our ethical and political judgments or reactions, and other things, including some of Sarah's personal anecdotes. She has several surprising takes on paternalism, which I hope you enjoy, and she's attracted some mixed fan mail over the years, but has some very strong and interesting arguments for her views. And here she is. So in a nutshell, what's the main thesis of your book?
Well, traditionally, ever since at least the Enlightenment, as we say, we thought of human beings as these really rational agents, as we call them, rational actors, people who are capable of choosing rationally. And we admit there are exceptions. You might be really drunk or crazy or something. But by and large, we say, left to your own devices, you make a rational decision. And that is especially true when it comes to doing what's in your own interest. That we are very good at knowing what is good for us and very good at choosing the means to getting what is good for us. But that's not entirely true. So recent psychology and economic theory, specifically what's called behavioral economics, because it looks at actual behavior, has shown that we are reliably bad in certain ways at making decisions. That irrelevancies, things that we ourselves would consider irrelevant, bias our choosing. And that because of that, we all too often make mistakes that have sometimes devastating outcomes for ourselves. So I argue that, look, in light of what we now know about people, what we ought to do is help them avoid those really dangerous mistakes. And sometimes the only way to help them avoid them is to take away the option of making a really bad mistake. So that's what I argue for, that sometimes the government, because that's usually the best agency to be able to do this, should make certain kinds of actions impossible because otherwise you're too likely to choose them and hurt yourself.
And it sounds, as you recognize, kind of very counterintuitive that we should remove decisions from people that concern their own lives. But I think you have some quite compelling or interesting arguments in the book for this view. So can you kind of talk about your defense of paternalism, maybe touching on this idea that we already accept a level of paternalism in our lives?
There are lots of cases where we all think paternalism is great. So, for example, when it comes to prescription medicine, so as we know, there's some medicine you can only get with a prescription, and in order to get a prescription, you have to see a doctor. Why? That's because we don't know much about medicine. And even if you as an individual go online and you Google what you think you've got and you come up with an explanation of, oh, I think it's this, we don't say, great, go to the drugstore and get it. Because one, you might not have the right diagnosis. Disease is complicated. You don't actually know what you've got. Two, the particular medicine you light on might be really bad for someone like you. It might be contraindicated because of other things about you. Or there might be another medicine that's actually much more efficient at doing the same thing. And your doctor knows about that. So we accept that. We don't think that the need for prescriptions means we're stupid. It just means we don't know much about medicine. So that's an obvious case of paternalism. One more case is seatbelt laws. So I actually remember when a law was introduced saying you had to wear a seatbelt. And a lot of people resented that because it's like, wait, it's my decision. But it became apparent that if your decision is not to use the seatbelt, and then you fly through the front windshield and die or have brain damage for the rest of your life, surprise, that's not actually what you wanted to have happen. So in order to get you where you want to be, in the case of prescription medicine, to get you cured, in the case of seatbelts, to keep you alive, we impose certain behaviors. And again, we all accept that. So all I'm arguing is that we should take this knowledge that we already have in specific cases and, in light of what we've learned about psychology, apply it more broadly. We need more government controls, not total control, it's not totalitarianism, but more government regulations in places where we currently have the freedom to choose.
Mm-hmm. It completely cuts against the idea, as you say, of like the rational agent who's able to choose for themselves and who should be respected in choosing for themselves. And so I think it's just, pretty interesting that you have a pretty impressive argument for a move directly against kind of the direction of our societies in terms of wanting more liberty and in wanting to press against even well understood restrictions on our freedom. And we have a hard enough time accepting restrictions on our freedoms when that's to help other people or to help the climate or to avert significant cost to others. And so when it comes to ourselves, I think we're going to be even more opposed to it.
I think it's actually the opposite. I think we have a hard time giving up something we want for the sake of other people or even the climate. But when it comes to paternalistic laws, I think there's always an initial resistance, as there are to most laws. But then we get used to it. So as I say, I remember when seatbelts became a legal requirement where I was living, and a lot of people didn't like it. Same with drunk driving laws. A lot of people like, I know, when I'm drunk, I'm not drunk just because I've had 5 beers. A lot of people resisted that. But my kids who grew up with seatbelt laws and as they got older with drunk driving laws, they're like, obviously, of course, that should be required. And yeah, we need a designated driver. Duh. So the initial resistance, if the law actually turns out to be beneficial, goes away because we are somewhat rational and we can see that here's a law where we had to give up something that wasn't really that important to us in order to get something that really was important to us.
Yeah, you're right that people have completely accepted drink driving laws, even though actually they are more of an imposition in the US, I think, than in most European cities or where I am in Montreal now in Canada, because everything's so spread out and you don't have this sort of like centralized city public transport setup, right? And yet people kind of adapt and change and accept, right?
And we do that, I think, in light of circumstances. There's this basic psychology which previously some people weren't aware of, but we could see a practice and that not having seatbelts was killing people or drunk driving was killing all these people. And once you draw attention to that, people go, oh, it's a problem. And eventually they go around to go, okay, I didn't like the fact that I'm being made to do this. I mean, for me, shoulder belts are quite uncomfortable because I'm short, but I'm like, sure, it's worth it.
Designed for the average man, perhaps, seatbelts.
Like so many things, yes.
So your brand of paternalism is kind of distinctive, I think. In a couple of key senses, you kind of have your own distinctive view. And one of them is about this common conception that under a paternalistic system, there must be kind of some distinction, implicit or explicit, between the wise and the unwise, the competent and the incompetent, and the rulers and the the ruled. And I think you say that's a mistake, right? But why? Because if we can't decide for ourselves and others sometimes know better, there is some intuitive sense in which they are above us, those who know that we are making a mistake that's kind of foolish or embarrassing.
Well, we are both those people. That is, in the case of medicine, I grant you, doctors know more than I do. That doesn't mean I think they're smarter or better people. They studied medicine. I didn't study medicine. I don't feel inferior. I just go, fine. Same with an auto mechanic. They know more about auto mechanics than I do. Fair enough. Their diagnosis of my car's problem is better. So there are cases of knowledge where some people have it and some people don't. That's not particularly insulting. It just means they studied medicine or auto mechanics. When it comes to other things, it's not a case of they're better generally at decision making than we are. It's not that we have a class of people, say, in government who are awesome at making decisions, whereas the rest of us poor plebeians are terrible. That's not what it is. What happens is this. All of us are somewhat better at making decisions when we are not involved in the situation. So, for example, we tend to have something called an optimism bias. So it's been shown that we all think we're above average drivers. Obviously, not possible. But when it comes to judging me, I think, well, I'm a good driver. I don't need the seatbelt or whatever. But when you're looking at it from a third person perspective, if I'm looking at you or my neighbor, I don't think, oh yeah, they're better than average. I think they're average. So sometimes when you're not involved, you can make the decision better. And when that person's making a decision for me, they can make it better. It's not about who's a better decision maker and who's a less good one. It's just about who's in the situation and who's a little removed and more objective.
Mm-hmm. Can you give other examples of cognitive biases? Because it's a kind of rich picture of human psychology that kind of underlies your whole book, and you're drawing attention to these biases. But can you give a few more examples of types and also instances?
There are tons of them, and it's practically a cottage industry now of people, psychologists going out and discovering more. So one thing that got a lot of attention or still gets a lot of attention, is called the status quo bias. So when this literature about cognitive biases, these sort of bad intellectual reflexes came out, some people argued, well, that can happen if the decision isn't important, but as soon as the decision is important, we really focus and we make a good decision. So then they studied people's decisions about pensions. So in the United States, if you get a job and you're lucky enough to have a pension, there are usually a couple of options. So you can either opt in and have a certain amount of money taken from your paycheck, which is vastly repaid by the business, or you can not do that. And what they found was if you give someone a choice and say, okay, if you do nothing, you will be in this beneficial plan, they stay with it. Not surprising. But if you say, if you do nothing, you will not be in this beneficial plan and you'll lose tons of money, they stick with it. People tend to accept whatever they're given. And they've talked to people. It's like, did you assume the company was giving you the best option for you? And they're like, no, it wasn't that. I mean, all you have to do is like check a little box. You don't have to do a lot of math. You just go, I want in the plan, I don't want in the plan. But for all these things, people tend to go with the default.
Yeah.
And there's no good explanation. If you talk to people, they'll usually say, well, I was going to switch. There's sort of a general procrastination. They don't want to say I wasn't going to switch because that would obviously be stupid. I mean, why wouldn't you check the box that gives you lots of money when you're retired versus the one that doesn't? But it's like an intellectual reflex, and we fall for it. Another one is Framing, the way you describe an action really affects whether someone will choose it. So this comes up a lot in medicine, and I've talked to actual physicians about this. If you have a surgery that is 80% successful, you don't have to be a math genius to know it's 20% unsuccessful. Similarly, if I say it's 20% unsuccessful, you don't have to be a math genius to see it's 80% successful. If the doctor describes it as it's 80% successful, people are much more willing to choose it than if it's described as 20% unsuccessful. Again, it's not that they don't do the math. It's just something about hearing the word unsuccessful that they go, no, despite the fact that that's not the message they're being given. And as I say, I've talked to doctors and they go, oh, yeah, absolutely. We always have to watch how we describe what we're offering, because if we think it's good for them, we want them to do it, we tell them that 80% successful, because otherwise they might be frightened off. Those are two. There's one more, something called anchoring. So say you want to buy a new car, and so you are intelligent, you go online, you read all the statistics, you read consumer reports, you read everything there is about it, and it says, I don't know, I'm making this up, the Toyota Prius is the best car. I don't know that that's true. That's an example. But then you're thinking, yeah, but my brother-in-law had one and it had a lot of problems. It's not that you don't believe the statistics. It's the fact that you have one vivid example and you go, not that one. It's just the power of a vivid example. But that makes us make a bad choice.
Yeah.
So we could say companies have to give the best option for the pension as the default. You know, framing, again, when you're making decisions about public policy, we could say, let's, you know, try to give them a way which seems least biased. So there are things you can do.
Yeah, like almost learning to work with our intellectual frailties that we're not really aware of and that sort of crop up on us.
Yeah, it
Here,
is.
there,
It
and
is
everywhere.
like a reflex. But when it comes to physical reflexes, we know we have them. If something comes to your face, you tend to blink. And sometimes you can control that maybe for a short period of time, but generally you're just going to blink. So it helps if you have someone else who can help you do what you need to do without having this intellectual bias that messes you up.
Yeah. So maybe a second area where your brand of paternalism is distinctive, I think, is maybe more controversial. So I think you say that no area of our lives is in principle off limits, right? There's no sphere of life that like we shouldn't interfere with in a paternalistic way without doing the calculations, without crunching the numbers in terms of the pros and the cons. So,
yes, in principle, that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, turns out there are places we probably shouldn't interfere because, in fact, it isn't worth it. But there's nothing that's off limits from the beginning.
So I think one kind of popular view might be that there are certain spheres of life that are in principle off limits because of the need for respect for autonomous decision making. So the example I have in mind, and you do discuss this in the book, is romance. So I definitely concede to you that not all decisions are kind of equal. Not every decision like commands respect. Like whether I wear a seatbelt or not is so far away from being something that's important to my conception of life or my identity that it seems fine if I'm forced to wear a seatbelt. But are there not some decisions where even if we would be worse decision makers than the next person, for like someone else could make a better decision about our lives for us than us, shouldn't we still be given the moral authority to make that call? So for example, if I have horrible style and I'm just terrible at picking my clothes and so on, a friend of mine might be able to make some decisions for me, including maybe tattooing on me some incredibly stylish thing that would improve my life and improve people's responses to me that have this great tattoo. But if they force the tattoo on me or if they do it against my will, we tend to think that my will has been disrespected in a relevant way, that I'm kind of the master of my bodily autonomy in some sense. And so my thought is that with romance, that the reason why the government shouldn't sort of tell us whom to marry isn't because of the cost benefit analysis, but because of respect for decision making, for like certain decisions that should remain ours.
Romance is interesting because, yes, for most of us, our romantic life consists primarily of failures. That is, at least in Western culture, you have a relationship, boyfriend, girlfriend, relationship, it fails, relationship, it fails, relationship, it fails, relationship, it fails. Then you get married, 50% chance of divorce.
Yeah.
And yet, we do value that. But I think the issue is not, is it in principle sacrosanct? There are a couple of things. One, we enjoy the process. I mean, you might not think you enjoy the process, but you don't enjoy the breakups, okay? But we enjoy getting out there, meeting people. We enjoy the development of the romance, even though there's a prospect of failure. And of course, our optimism bias comes in because although 50% of marriages end in divorce, no one standing at the altar goes, yeah, 50-50. They all think they're going to make it. Anyway, I think we enjoy the process. And in that case, giving that process up is one of the costs to be reckoned. We would really mind. Two, I have no reason to think the government or anyone else could make a better choice. So there are cultures, of course, where they have arranged marriages. And people there, I don't know about all of them. I've only personally known a couple of people who are in arranged marriages. And they weren't forced into it. Their family came up with a suitable guy, and they got to meet the guy first and so forth. But they were actually okay with that because they had a different idea of, the importance of romance. So I don't know that those are better than they would have done by themselves, but they may not have been worse. So I would say two things. One, we really enjoy this process. We obviously write novels and songs about it. It's really important to us. So giving it up would be a great cost. And although giving it up might give us a better outcome, I don't know that it would, especially if the government did it, because they don't know your peculiar personality the way your family might.
Yeah, I mean, I found myself saying in the past that if I were single and if someone gave me a scientific program where you could input, say, answer 250 questions about your values and your personality and how you react to certain scenarios, and so on, that I think that would be quite a good idea as a way of finding someone to go on a date with, because a dating app, you might get 5 pictures and 2 lines of text, whereas a scientific program that basically screens out anyone who has a serious looking incompatibility with you, that might be quite a valuable tool. But I think the reason why I would be drawn to that is that I still get to choose, right? And I think in the case of arranged marriages, people still get to ultimately choose, no, I don't want to marry this person. But they might have a kind of revolving menu of options, but they can still say, I don't want to, in this case. And maybe there are kind of background differences in moral theory between us, but there seems to be something strange about the ultimate decision being not in our hands.
Well, again, I think that matters to us, but I think a lot of these liberties do not. So when we're looking at the costs, it is just per se something that should never be given up. We're looking at how much it would bother us to give it up, because that is a relevant cost. So when I look at where a paternalistic measure makes sense, I have some criteria. One is that the thing that's being prevented is an activity that is really opposed to your long-term interests. So going through the windshield, definitely opposed to your long-term interest. unhappy marriage is opposed to your long-term interest, but you might have some long-term interest in dating, and going out and meeting people. And I also say the measure to prevent it has to be effective. And again, I don't know that, we can imagine maybe an external force that would be more effective, but we don't really have that yet. So we just don't meet the criteria for a good a legitimate paternalistic intervention. That's not because it's in principle something we shouldn't do. It's because in this case, it looks like it wouldn't work.
Mm.
If I may talk about respect, because you mentioned it. Okay. So people complain about paternalism. They often say, yes, it may get us where we want to go, but it's disrespectful. And my question is always, how is it disrespectful? If you tell me I can't jump 6 feet, that's not disrespectful because I can't jump 6 feet. If you tell me I'm a terrible basketball player, that's not disrespectful. I am a terrible basketball player. I can barely even make the ball bounce. So saying you can't do something when in fact you can't do that isn't disrespectful, it's accurate. And when it comes to being perfect decision makers, we just aren't. Saying you are is like the emperor's new clothes. That's disrespectful. It's sort of leading you to believe in this thing which you don't really have because you think you'll be diminished if you don't have it. How are you diminished? No one is changing you. You have the ability you have. And if we discover that it's not as good as you thought it was, you're the same as you were before. We've just given a different assessment. And with that different assessment, we're able to help you achieve your own goals. I think if we respect people, we can show that by helping them get where they want to be. They don't want to go through the windshield. So help them get where they want to be. If you respect rational nature, I think you should do things to make it thrive. And these are all measures which would help do that. If I say, yeah, make your own decision, it's going to kill you, but fine, I respect you. Thanks a lot for that. Now I'm dead. I would rather have interventions that respect my nature by helping it to grow and evolve and thrive than quote unquote respect that allows me to destroy myself and then says, well, it's her own fault. She chose it.
I mean, it does make me think of the kind of slim minority. Would you think there's a slim minority who are kind of the sun cream wearing, spinach eating, gym going, pension subscribing people who are, it's pretty hard to find them making a kind of obviously instrumentally irrational decision. That's very harmful. I concede that everyone makes harmful decisions about their own lives, but there are some people who would never say go through a windshield or not have a pension or not wear adequate sun cream.
Maybe there are. I don't know. I mean, they're probably not going to go through the windshield because now we have laws that prevent them from doing that. As to the rest, I'm pretty healthy, but do I wear enough sunblock? I always mean to, but then you're supposed to reapply. I don't know.
It's demanding,
but say that there is. I mean, maybe there's someone out there, very unlikely, who never makes a decision that goes against their own interests. Yay for them. These laws aren't going to hurt them.
Right.
They're just going to go, yeah, you're already doing it. Don't worry about it. Fine. They're there for the people who wouldn't do that, whose short-term actions conflict with their long-term goals. Those are the ones we want to help.
Yeah, so I think we should probably bring out that your kind of criterion for whether a paternalistic policy is justified is a cost-benefit analysis of like, are the harms outweighed by the benefits, or more specifically, are we maximizing by bringing this policy in kind of benefits over harms? And also, secondly, you do say, don't you, that like you're not trying to impose like ends on people, like you're not trying to impose goals on people. It's taking people's ends and goals as they currently are and then seeking to help people get there.
Yes, that's important. There have been forms of paternalism in the past that have tried to impose values on you, like religion in particular has done some of this. You're better off as a Christian. I don't care what you say, you're better off as a Christian. And so, we'll punish you if you don't become a Christian. That's not my form. I have what they call a subjective view of welfare, meaning what's good for you is a function of what you want in the long term. But we all know we have long-term goals, and sometimes we have these short-term, oops, I shouldn't have done that, but I did things. So I think we want to look at your values, your goals, and then help you get there by avoiding these mistakes that make you think, I'm such a good driver, I don't need a seatbelt. Or this surgery has a 20% chance of failure, so I won't get surgery, even though that has a 95% chance of liver failure or something. Yeah, so it's in terms of what you want.
Yeah, I think that's a surprising combination of views that you hold, because we'd associate paternalism with people who have quite rigid and objective views about well-being, and then we'd associate liberalism with people who have a subjective view of well-being, which says the good life is just constituted by your own values and goals, rather than the good life is that you have, achievements of this kind and a meeting with God of this type, and so on. But you're combining a subjective view of welfare with paternalism.
Because there are two things out there. There are your goals, what we call your ends, and there are the means you choose to get there. And your goals are your goals. I don't know where our goals come from, our parents, our culture, genetic, whatever. They're there. And it's really hard to show that someone has a bad goal. It's what they want. I mean, some people, I don't know, they want to be great basketball players. Great, fine by me. Means are the actions you take along the way that you want to get you to your goals. And that's where we can actually weigh in and say, actually, this is a bad choice. I can't judge your goals. But if you think that the best way to live a long and happy life is to not wear your seatbelt because you find it constricting, you've made a mistake. It isn't. And there we can justifiably intervene.
So let's talk about applications of your theory, because, well, firstly, what decisions do you think should be removed from us?
Well, I think smoking should be illegal. We have made progress. So at one point, they eventually discovered that smoking caused cancer. And yes, not in 100% of cases, but it is a cause of cancer. And so the first reaction to that was to educate people, say, causes cancer. And the traditional liberal view was, well, then everyone will stop smoking because, who wants cancer? Smoking isn't really worth it. But it didn't work that well. What has been more effective, still isn't what I want, has been raising the price. That's kind of coercive. You can still do it, but it's really, really costly. The other thing we've done is made it hard to find a place to smoke. When I was young, you could smoke in restaurants, you could smoke in bars, you could smoke in airplanes.
Yeah, it's crazy.
There was a smoking section and a non-smoking section. But now, at least where I work, you couldn't smoke outside within 30 feet of the door. So between the high costs and the difficulty in being able to find a place to smoke, we have reduced the numbers. And that's great. But I would say, look, we're already kind of pushing people. Let's just make smoking illegal. And we would, if it were introduced today and we said, here's this carcinogenic product which has no health benefits, would you approve it? Everyone would go, no, of course not. Don't be ridiculous. But because it's already in place and because the tobacco industries have a lot of power, it's still legal. but it shouldn't be.
Mm. And were you surprised by the UK and its move to try to make smoking illegal for anyone who's born after 2009? When you wrote the book, I imagine that you didn't think it would become almost kind of policy in a major country sometime later.
It's great. People do make progress. I wish they'd make it a little more quickly. But yeah, I think, and again, there's so much rhetoric about, oh, but that's giving away my liberty to take on this carcinogenic addictive substance, which is really, really expensive. And my answer is, yeah.
There is part of me that thinks that smoking is kind of quite close to some people's identity and conceptions of their life. So, I mean, like, I think Joseph Raz is one of the biggest defenders of autonomy, right? And even he says that there are some decisions which basically don't affect your autonomy. There are some like removals of choice that are inconsequential for your autonomy. So someone saying you can't have this flavor of ice cream anymore, or you can't have this specific food, he thinks that's such a small option doesn't affect your ability to be kind of the part author of your life. I guess autonomy is like, self-government, right? So it's you can still be self-governing even if you can't pick, I don't know, a salted fudge, caramel, brownie, marshmallow ice cream, but
nothing against them.
but smoking does seem to, in a way, be the kind of decision where for some people it seems important to them. So imagine someone who's, say, 20 years old, and for the remaining 2 years they have at university, they want to smoke for those 2 years, maybe like 2 cigarettes a week or 4 cigarettes a week on a weekend, and they are making a gamble that they won't get addicted. But suppose their values are such that smoking is really important for them. So they live for the weekend, they live for the nights out. They're maybe quite angry at the world and they're kind of not having a great time. So for them, living beyond 65 isn't that important. And it helps them, and it helps them to meet friends and to. Could you not imagine a kind of person for whom smoking is kind of so close to their identity that it's really
their
important?
Their whole identity is based on these 2 cigarettes a week, you're saying?
No, suppose
maybe it's 4.
Suppose they're kind of like a goth, or I don't know, like some sort of rocker, whatever it is, and they have their identity is based around music and style and smoking and drinking and being a cool person, for example, and not around getting a good career and having a family and this kind of thing.
So you think if smoking were illegal, there'd be no way to be cool? There'd be no way to express rebellion?
I guess not. But it seems to be
There's
an enjoyable way of doing it.
Well, it's one way, but yeah, you just said their identity was based around it. Now you're saying it's enjoyable. Those are two different things. I do imagine people can be identified with being a rebel or something. But there are lots of ways to do that aren't addictive and carcinogenic and that you can stop if you later want to. I've certainly had students who smoked. So I'm a college teacher, university teacher, and I say, "What's up with this? You seem like a rational person. Why are you smoking?" And they uniformly say, "Well, once I'm out of school and I don't have any more pressure, then I'll give it up." And, anyone who's out of school is like, seriously? Once you're actually working for a living, trying to find a job, you don't have the housemaid cleaning up your room, then you're going to not have pressure? It's ridiculous. So I think if pressure is the reason they're smoking, they're liable to keep it up. So, no, I think it's a bad choice. I think there are other things you can do. Pressure is a real thing. The desire to rebel is a real thing. But there are other ways you can do that don't have the same effects.
Yeah. And I guess some of them could be really healthy, like finding a community of people who feel the same way and that kind of bonding, and that can be extraordinarily beneficial for your health, right, to find that community. So you want to intervene as well with things like trans fats, which I think are outlawed in the EU, I think, and in the UK.
That was an easy one, yeah.
Yeah. And there's a couple of other ones, I think. Portion size control for fast food and other restaurants.
Yeah. We know, not everywhere, but certainly in the United States and some other countries, there's what they call an obesity crisis. In the United States, 40% of adults are obese. it is, again, just bad for your health. It leads to heart disease, to type 2 diabetes, to various sorts of cancer, to fatty liver disease. It also makes it hard to do things like go for a walk or climb a mountain or play tennis with somebody. And there is an absolute correlation between the rise of obesity and portion size. Other things also contribute, like sugar subsidies that mean it's cheaper to buy soda than a bottle of water. But portion size is a huge contributor. And some years ago, New York tried to pass a law saying that fast food places could only sell 16-ounce sodas, not 32-ounce sodas. If you're really, really thirsty, you could get two 16-ounce sodas. But the fast food place couldn't just give you a 32-ounce soda.
It's Will here, just to clarify for non-US listeners, that 32 ounces is just under a litre, 950 millilitres. For UK listeners, that's close to 1.7 pints.
So they tried to do this, and the soda companies fought it because they knew people didn't really want 32 ounces of soda. If you go up to the cashier and they say, you can get 32 ounces for just 20 cents more, people go, oh, that's more for not much money. Sure, I'll do it. But they're not going to make an effort because they don't really want it. But if you give into it, they'll drink it. Unfortunately, the law didn't stick because the court decided that the wrong part of the New York government had come up with it. Anyway, I think that's a great idea.
Okay, but I guess one thought reading the book was, why not go further? So it struck me that you have this very bold argument, but then the way you apply it maybe isn't as bold. So here's a list of possible paternalistic policies that I've just quickly written, and I want to know why, on your view, they're not things that we ought to do. So we could have sun cream checkpoints at beaches and at parks on hot days to make sure people are carrying at least sun cream, even if they're not wearing it. We could have bans on sunbeds. We could ban the sugary versions of Coke and so on. So you still have Diet Coke, but you don't have full sugar Coke. We could introduce calorie or alcohol credit cards where basically, as well as paying for your alcohol or your food, you have a certain number of points. So you're only allowed to drink, 5 pints of beer a night, or you're only allowed to buy a certain number of units of alcohol a week. And basically people are kind of constrained in how much they can buy.
Clearly English. Okay, go on.
I mean, so like my question is that if you're serious about the fact that we're slightly irrational in some cases, and if you're serious about the harms that these things caused, and about the effectiveness of policies, because you also reject nudge economics based on the fact that it doesn't really work. This idea that we shouldn't intervene in people's choices, but we should just make the easier or healthier choice, slightly easier. Why aren't these policies a good idea? Because I don't think that the health crises that we're facing would be dealt with by portion control and soda restrictions.
I don't know, because I don't know all the facts. As I've said, it's a cost-benefit analysis. There are two kinds of costs. One is the cost to the individual. How much do they mind being checked for their sunblock? My guess is not much, but I don't know. But there's also the cost to society. We have to pay for the sun cream checkers, because although we are concerned about the individual, obviously we're concerned about all individuals, which means that we're concerned about the cost of a paternalistic policy on other people, not just on the person who benefits from it. So in all those cases, I just don't know the facts.
So you're open to these being implications of a view if the relevant facts obtained, but not otherwise not, basically. So I had only a few more questions, and one of them was about control. So I think obviously people don't want to lose control, and as you kind of say in the book, people want to have control. But I guess I thought that control had kind of emerged as a political theme recently. So from Brexit to COVID to low traffic neighborhoods, and forgive me if these are kind of partly UK centric examples, but you say rather surprisingly that paternalism, so taking choices away from people, will increase people's control overall. So can you explain how that's the case?
Well, there are in a couple of ways. One, so take the fact that because of the government, I can't go out and buy just anything that's marketed as a car. Cars have to pass safety standards, and that makes them much more expensive than they would be if they didn't have to pass safety standards. And given how expensive they are, it is conceivable the government might just say, okay, go ahead, no standards, it's up to you, the individual. If you want a safe car, find one. If you want the cheap car made of cardboard, good. That would be bad for me because I do want a safe car, but I do not want to have to spend all the time it would take to figure out what is a safe car. Like, what should the impact be, and what kind of impact does this much steel have, and how much rubber is the tires to put? I mean, that would be exhausting. And that would take away my ability to make choices I care about, which are more like, what kind of dog do I want? And what color am I going to paint my dining room? And where do I want to go on vacation? Because I would spend months trying to research this stupid car choice, which, thank God, someone else is doing. So it would take away my liberty because I would have to spend all this time looking into stuff that I would rather someone else did. Or B, it would take away my liberty because I go, to hell with it, I can't figure it out. I'll buy the cardboard car, and boom, then I'm in an accident, and I have very little liberty once I'm severely injured or brain damaged or dead. So these sorts of choices give you liberty to not have to worry about sorts of things, and they give you the liberty to live more satisfactory lives in which you're going to be making all sorts of really interesting choices that you care about.
Despite your very impressive arguments on this topic, people will still, I think, as you say, often reject them, and they'll reject paternalism, and they'll say, it strikes me as counterintuitive and I don't like the sound of it. But you argue, I think, interestingly and plausibly, that not all intuitions about what's ethical or a good policy are equal. That is, not all of our judgments or reflections on ethics and politics are equal, and that we shouldn't always trust our gut. So can you unpack that idea that sometimes we have the right, we make reliably accurate judgments about what's fair or what's politically a good idea, and other times we're kind of off in some way?
Well, the first thing to notice is that it's very hard to tell if you are subject to a cognitive bias or not. I said it was like a reflex, but physical reflexes are easier. You can tell when they're happening. You know, someone tosses something at your face, you blink, they run their finger through your palm and your fingers curl. You can tell when they're happening. Cognitive bias, it's hard to tell if you're suffering from it or not. I mean, and we don't want to, but if I say, am I being over optimistic? It's like, well, I'm not sure. So that means that we can't just trust our judgment. If you try to say, well, in this case, I'm really, really certain, it turns out that certainty is not a good guide. The fact that you feel really certain does not typically rely on your having a good reason for your judgment. We tend to be more certain about a judgment if it's familiar to us or if lots of people around us believe it. But that doesn't mean it's correct. So again, that's why I think rather than me introspecting and saying, I'm thinking really hard about this, it's better to outsource some decisions to people who might actually have experts who look at auto safety or something, or whether my optimism bias is legitimate when I think I'm a better than average driver and don't need a seatbelt.
Yeah, and I think it's such an important point about how familiarity can drive our sense of what's right or our sense of what's fair or just. And actually, familiarity might just be the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
So I basically got one more question for you, which is about your experience. So you're an American academic and you published this book in America, and you wrote it with Americans and others in mind. But America is possibly the most hostile country to the idea of paternalism, to the idea of freedoms being taken away. So can you tell us what your experience has been of the reception of the book and any stories about that?
Yes, we're the country that needs it the most. I mean, I think many places could benefit from a bit more government intervention, but to some places that's not bizarre and amazing. Yeah, well, I was, at the time this book came out, I was 60, I guess, or close to 60. I was a 60-year-old woman living in a small town in a rural state, and I was shocked to discover that I got all of this hate mail. I mean, why do people take the time? It was mainly hate email, but still, they had to find my email address and, take the trouble to write me and say that people like me are the reason we need the right to bear arms. That was when I got, also, people wrote opinion columns. I was compared a lot to Hitler, sometimes to Stalin. Like they were benevolent? I don't think so. Occasionally to Mao Zedong, but just over and over without. I don't know. It was like, did these people read the book? I don't think so. Maybe it was just the title, because Hitler, shocker, was not benevolent. He wasn't trying to help people. Yes, he took away freedom, but not to help people. That's different. So I certainly got negative responses. On the other hand, I got a few really nice letters saying, thank God someone's willing to say this. So I think hate mail, I didn't enjoy it. I did not like it, but it's a small price to pay. It's an email and you delete it as soon as you see the word loathsome in the subject line. It's like, okay.
So you stopped reading the contents of these emails after some time?
Eventually, I was getting a lot of them, and they were pretty repetitive. You don't get usually thoughtful, articulate things that say you're like Hitler. I did get thoughtful, articulate criticism. That's a whole different thing, but that's not hate mail. That's fine. And those could be interesting. And I'm sure, I've made mistakes. But a lot of people, there was some guy on the radio who talked about it, and that got a lot of people writing in.
I see. Yeah. Well, I hope that this episode won't reignite any such emails.
I can live with it if they do. So.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for a wonderful conversation and a great book. It's been really interesting. So yeah, thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you very much for talking to me. It was fun.
Thank you so much for listening, everyone. If you like what I'm doing here, please do follow Surprising Ethics and consider sharing this podcast with a friend of yours. It's totally free and will remain free, and your support is really valued. I'd like to thank the Centre for Research in Ethics, an academic research centre based in Montreal, for its kind support of this podcast. And I look forward to seeing you on the 1st of next month for more Surprising Ethics.